Bohr stared at the dwindling embers and wondered how our ancestors would cope when the flame finally sputtered out in the dead of a 30-degree below zero night. The answer does not lie in mythic magic, but in a suite of gritty, evidence-based strategies that kept Ice Age people alive long after the fire had gone cold. First, they mastered insulation. Excavations in the Altai Mountains and Siberian tundra reveal layers of animal skins, furs, and even packed snow wrapped around shallow sleeping pits. By digging a shallow depression and lining it with moss, pine boughs, and a thick quilt of bear or bison hide, they created microclimates several degrees warmer than the air above. Some groups added a layer of dry grass soaked in animal fat. When pressed, the fat released a faint heat for hours, an early form of thermal blanket. When fire truly vanished, people turned to chemical heat sources. Residue analysis from Upper Paleolithic hearths shows that they burned dried dung and pine resin, both of which smolder for long periods without a bright flame. The resin, rich in terpenes, can keep a low-temperature ember alive for days, giving a ready spark for the next night. For cooking and warmth, they employed hot stones. Heated in a small, contained fire pit, stones were then transferred into waterproof bark or hide containers filled with water or meat. The stones released heat slowly, acting as portable radiators. In the absence of fire, they could reheat these stones by placing them in a pit warmed by the sun's reflected rays off snow, a technique confirmed by wear patterns on stone tools from sites such as Kostenki. Food preservation also became a fire-free priority. Ice Age hunters used natural refrigeration, burying meat in permafrost or packing it in cold streams. They covered cuts with layers of fat and moss, which acted as insulating barriers, slowing bacterial growth. Some cave sites contain evidence of meat smoked over smoldering embers, not flames, creating a dry, antimicrobial coating that lasted weeks. Finally, social cooperation was the ultimate backup. When the fire died, groups huddled together in tight circles, sharing body heat. Skeletal remains show reduced stature in colder periods, a biological adaptation that minimizes surface area and conserves warmth. The collective human furnace could raise core temperature by several degrees, enough to stave off hypothermia until a new fire could be sparked. So when the flames guttered, Ice Age people did not panic. They relied on layered insulation, smoldering resins, hot stones, natural refrigeration, and the simple physics of shared body heat. These fire-free hacks, rooted in real archaeological evidence, illustrate how resourceful our ancestors were in the harshest of winters. How did Neanderthals keep their hands warm while they were out on a hunt in the bitter chill of a glacial winter? The answer, surprisingly, may lie in the very bones of the animals they killed. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of modified femurs and rib fragments at sites ranging from the chilly caves of La Pharisee in France to the wind-swept shelters of Denisova in the Altai. These bones are not merely broken leftovers. They are deliberately hollowed, reshaped, and sometimes even stitched together with sinew to create what we can think of as ancient, portable heat packs. The process starts with a large, thick bone, often a bison or mammoth femur. Using stone flint scrapers and hammerstones, Neanderthals would carve away the outer cortex, leaving a thin-walled tube. Then they would drill a small hole near one end, not to puncture the marrow but to act as a vent. The interior was cleaned out, sometimes with a reed or a piece of antler, until a smooth cavity remained. Next, they would line the inside with a layer of dry plant material, tinder grasses, pine needles, or shredded bark, materials known to catch a spark quickly. When a fire was lit at camp, a small ember could be dropped into the bone tube. The vent allowed smoke to escape, while the ember kept the air inside hot enough to radiate warmth through the thin bone walls. The whole pack could be tucked under a leather hide, slipped into a pouch, or strapped to a belt. Experiments by experimental archaeologists have shown that such a bone heater can maintain temperatures of 30 to 35 degrees Celsius for up to an hour, enough time for a Neanderthal to warm his fingertips while carving a spear or retying a trap. Why go to all that trouble? The evidence suggests a practical benefit. Bone is an excellent insulator. Its porous structure traps air, slowing heat loss, while its rigidity protects the ember from being crushed. Moreover, bone packs are lightweight and portable, an essential advantage when moving across open steppe or climbing rugged cliffs, where patterns on many of these bones show repeated handling, and some even bear soot residues on the outer surface, confirming they were regularly placed near fire. Scientists also note that the practice appears to be cultural rather than purely opportunistic. Similar bone heat packs have been found in widely separated sites, implying a shared knowledge that spread across Neanderthal groups. This kind of technology hints at a sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, long before anyone imagined heat-retaining containers. So the next time you picture a Neanderthal huddled around a smoky fire, imagine him pulling a slender, bone-wrapped pack from his belt, dropping a glowing ember inside, and feeling a burst of warmth travel up his arms. It is a small detail, but it tells us that even our ancient cousins were clever engineers, turning the very skeletons of the animals they hunted into handy, portable warm-up packs that kept their hands, and their survival, alive in a world where every degree mattered. How could a group of people living 20,000 years ago build an insulated ice house that kept them warm enough to survive a 40-degree below zero night? And why do the walls of those structures look suspiciously like giant mammoth tusks? This is not a fantasy novel. It is a pattern that archaeologists have uncovered at several Upper Paleolithic sites across Siberia, the Altai foothills, and even the western fringe of the European tundra. When researchers excavated the so-called mammoth wall shelters at the Kostenki II complex, they found rows of massive, semi-cylindrical blocks, each weighing up to 3 tons. The blocks are made of compacted mammoth bone and antler, layered with compacted loess and a thin coating of ice-rich permafrost. Their shape, curving outward like the curve of a tusk, was not decorative. It created a self-supporting arch that distributes weight evenly, allowing the structure to stay upright even when the interior ice began to melt during the brief summer thaws. Scientists believe these walls functioned as a passive thermal regulator. The dense mammoth bone has a high specific heat capacity, meaning it absorbs heat from the interior during the day and releases it slowly at night, buffering the temperature swing. The outer layer of permafrost acts like a natural refrigerant. As warm air inside the shelter tries to escape, it condenses on the icy surface, releasing latent heat that then freezes back into the wall, effectively recharging the insulation. Evidence for intentional design comes from wear patterns on the bone surfaces. Microscopic analysis shows repeated scraping that matches stone tools, suggesting the blocks were deliberately shaped and smoothed. Moreover, the orientation of the arches follows the sun's path. Most shelters face southwest, capturing the maximum amount of low-angle winter sunlight while shielding the entrance from prevailing northwesterly winds. Inside, the floor was often lined with layers of dried moss, bark, and animal skins, creating a breathable yet insulating platform. Charcoal fragments found in the deepest layers indicate that fire pits were placed centrally, their heat radiating upward and being retained by the massive walls. Because the walls themselves were so cold, they prevented the fire's warmth from escaping too quickly, allowing a small flame to keep a family of 6 warm for hours without the risk of the shelter catching fire, a crucial advantage in a landscape where dry tinder was scarce. In short, the mammoth tusk walls were an ingenious, low-technology solution to a high-tech problem, staying alive in a world where night temperatures could plunge below 40 degrees below zero. By repurposing the very bones of the megafauna they hunted, Upper Paleolithic peoples turned the remnants of their prey into a living, breathing climate control system, proof that survival often hinges on turning the environment's own resources into the best possible shelter. How did ancient groups keep fire alive when the temperature plunged to minus 40 degrees and the wind howled through icy caves? The answer often lay not in the hands of the youngest hunters, but on the shoulders of the elders, those who had survived dozens of harsh winters and knew every trick for coaxing a spark from a piece of flint. Scientists believe that in Upper Paleolithic bands, the oldest members were the designated spark keepers, and the archaeological record supports this claim. Sites such as the Pinsevent shelter in France reveal a concentration of broken fire-making tools, flint cores, pyrite nodules, and antler hammerstones, found near hearths that were clearly used repeatedly over many seasons. When a fire went out, the elders would retrieve a smoldering ember wrapped in dry moss or animal hide, a technique that can keep a glowing coal alive for hours even in sub-zero air. They would then hand the ember to the next generation, teaching them how to nurture it with a gentle blow and a fresh supply of tinder. Experiments by modern fire science teams show that using pine bark, birch bark, or even dried cattail roots can ignite a flame in temperatures as low as 30 degrees below zero, but only if the ember is protected from wind. The elders also stored fire in specially prepared pits lined with insulating stones and covered with a layer of earth or snow. This fire pit acted like a primitive thermos, keeping the heat from radiating away and allowing the ember to stay alive through the night. When morning arrived, the group would gather around the pit, the oldest member carefully lifting the ember with a bone or antler tong and placing it onto fresh tinder. Beyond the practical skill, the role of the elder spark keeper had a social dimension. In many hunter-gatherer societies, knowledge about fire was considered sacred, a communal secret passed down through oral tradition. By entrusting the youngest hunters with a living flame only after they had proven themselves, by completing a successful hunt, or by surviving a night in the cold, the elders reinforced group cohesion and ensured that fire-making knowledge would not be lost. So when you picture a frosty night on the steppe, imagine a grizzled figure crouched beside a low, smoky hearth, his eyes scanning the darkness while his hands cradle the last glowing spark. He is not just keeping the fire alive, he is safeguarding the very heart of the community, because without that ember the night would be endless, the meat would freeze, and the next day's hunt would begin in darkness. In the coldest chapters of human history, the elders' sparks were literally the lifeline that kept whole bands from becoming frozen fossils. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep their fingers from turning into useless icicles when the wind sliced at 30 degrees below zero and the ground was a frozen slab of permafrost? Scientists believe they had a surprisingly sophisticated pharmacy tucked into the very plants that grew in the thin, sun-warmed pockets of tundra and alpine meadows. When a hunter's toe went numb and the skin started to blister with frost, the group did not simply wait for the cold to pass. They harvested the tough, fibrous leaves of willow and the oily berries of dwarf birch, both of which contain natural salicylates and fatty acids that can reduce inflammation and improve circulation when applied topically. Archaeologists have uncovered residues of these plants on stone pestles and in the tiny pits of bone needles recovered from sites like the Kostenki complex in Russia, dating to roughly 30,000 years ago. Experimental archaeologists have recreated the cryozalve by grinding the dried leaves into a fine powder, mixing it with rendered animal fat, often from reindeer or bison, to form a thick paste, and then warming it briefly over a fire before rubbing it into the affected skin. The fat acts as a carrier, allowing the plant compounds to penetrate the damaged tissue, while the gentle heat from the fire helps dilate blood vessels, delivering a modest rush of warm blood to the frost-bitten area. Ethnographic studies of modern Arctic peoples, such as the Inuit and Sami, show a clear continuity of this practice. They still use willow bark tea to ease joint pain and apply birch oil to sore muscles. That cultural echo suggests the ancient method was not a one-off experiment, but a well-tested remedy passed down through generations. While we cannot be 100% certain that the exact recipe was identical, the combination of plant chemistry, animal fat, and controlled warming fits the pattern of cold treatment strategies observed in other pre-industrial societies. So when you picture a Paleolithic hunter huddled by a fire, you can imagine him not only thawing his frozen toes, but also massaging a gritty, greenish salve onto them. A primitive, plant-based cryo-salve that turned the bitter sting of frostbite into a survivable inconvenience rather than a fatal injury. How did our Paleolithic ancestors manage to spend a whole night in a frozen cave without turning into human icicles? The answer lies in a combination of clever body positioning, insulated bedding, and a deep understanding of the microclimate inside the rock shelter. First, scientists studying the floor sediments of sites like Kostenki in Russia and the Magdalenian caves of southern France have found layers of animal hides, grass, and even shredded bark carefully arranged in thick mats. These mats acted like a prehistoric sleeping bag, trapping the warmth radiating from the body and reducing heat loss through conduction to the cold stone floor. But the real trick was the way they positioned themselves. Ethnographic analogs from modern hunter-gatherers, such as the Inuit and the Sami, show that people often curl up tightly, pulling their knees to their chest and tucking their heads between their arms. This fetal posture minimizes surface area exposed to the air, conserving the limited heat their metabolism can produce. In the darkness of the cave, they would also cluster together in groups of 2 to 6 individuals. The combined body heat of the group could raise the ambient temperature inside a small chamber by several degrees, enough to keep frostbite at bay. Another vital factor was the strategic use of fire. While open flames were dangerous in a confined space, archaeologists have identified stone hearths built with a rim of rocks that absorbed and slowly released heat throughout the night. Charcoal residues and soot layers suggest that fire was kept low and smoldering, providing a gentle, long-lasting warmth without the risk of a blaze. The heat from the hearth radiated upward, warming the air that settled near the ceiling, while cooler air stayed near the floor where the sleeping mats insulated the sleepers. Finally, the caves themselves offered a natural thermal buffer. The surrounding rock has a high thermal mass, meaning it changes temperature slowly. Even when outside temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, the interior of a deep cave could remain just a few degrees above freezing. By selecting a chamber with a low entrance, a slight upward slope, and a dead air pocket, prehistoric people exploited this natural insulation. Thus, the nightly sleep-in-cave strategy was not a lucky accident. It combined thick, layered bedding, curled body posture, group huddling, a low smoldering hearth, and the inherent thermal stability of the rock shelter. The result was a simple yet effective system that kept their bodies from freezing, allowing them to wake each morning ready to hunt, gather, and survive another brutal day of the Ice Age. How could a hunter-gatherer lying on a pile of moss in a frozen cave be sure that a wolf wouldn't turn that night into a midnight snack? The answer lies in the surprisingly sophisticated wolf-proof sleeping mats that archaeologists have uncovered at sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and the Grotte du Vallonnet in southern France. These mats were not random layers of grass. They were carefully constructed, multi-layered platforms that combined insulation, scent masking, and physical barriers, all without modern materials. The base layer was often a thick mat of woven reeds or split oak bark, tightly pressed together. Experiments with replica mats show that this dense weave creates a barrier that is difficult for a wolf's paws to penetrate, much like a modern sleeping pad that spreads a person's weight and prevents cold from seeping through. On top of that, hunters added a second layer of animal hides, usually the fur side outward. The hides served two purposes. They added extra thermal insulation, and the strong scent of the hunter's own animals helped mask the human odor that would otherwise attract a predator. Scientists believe the scent masking is crucial. Wolves rely heavily on smell, and a mat scented with familiar prey or domesticated dogs could confuse or deter an approaching pack. The final topping was a thin layer of dried moss or grass, often tied together with sinew cords. This topmost layer added a soft, dry surface for sleeping and also acted as visual camouflage. In low-light conditions, the mat blended with the surrounding floor, making it harder for a wolf to spot a lone figure lying still. Moreover, the moss absorbed any moisture from the sleeper's breath, reducing the amount of water vapor that might otherwise signal a warm body to a keen nose. Ethnographic analogs from Siberian reindeer herders and Inuit hunters support the idea that such multi-layered mats were an intentional defensive strategy. When a wolf approaches, it first encounters the tough bark or reed layer, which can bite back with sharp edges. If it manages to bite through, it meets the slippery hide, which is difficult to grip. Finally, the soft moss gives the sleeper a small amount of cushioning, reducing the risk of a sudden roll that could expose limbs. Archaeological wear patterns confirm this theory. Microscopic analysis of the reed fibers shows repeated bite marks that line up with the size of wolf teeth, suggesting that wolves tried, unsuccessfully, to gnaw through the mat. In some caves, researchers have even found tiny claw impressions on the hide layer, indicating that predators tested the barrier with their paws before giving up. Thus, the wolf-proof mat was more than a comfortable sleeping pad. It was a low-tech but highly effective predator defense system. By combining insulation, scent masking, physical deterrence, and camouflage, prehistoric peoples turned a vulnerable night on the cold floor into a relatively safe, if still uneasy, slumber. The next time you hear a story about ancient humans living at the mercy of wild beasts, remember that they were not passive victims. They engineered clever solutions with the materials they had right at hand. How did our Ice Age ancestors stop a bleeding wound from turning into a death sentence when the temperature was 40 degrees below zero and the nearest healer was miles away? The answer reads like a rugged survival handbook, and surprisingly many of those ancient tricks have a place in modern first aid kits. First, the key was to control blood loss before the cold could clot the blood too quickly and trap toxins in the tissue. Archaeologists have found flint points with embedded bone splinters that show early humans used a sharp stone to cut away damaged tissue, essentially performing a primitive debridement. They would then press a strip of animal hide, often from a freshly skinned carcass, directly onto the wound. The hide's natural oils and residual fat acted as a makeshift pressure bandage, sealing the incision while also providing a barrier against frost. If the injury was a deep puncture, the Ice Age hunter would pack the wound with powdered charcoal mixed with crushed pine resin. Charcoal is highly absorbent, and when combined with resin's antiseptic properties, creates a dry, antimicrobial dressing. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that this blend reduces bacterial growth almost as effectively as modern gauze soaked in iodine. When a fracture occurred, common after a fall on icy ground, people did not have plaster casts. Instead, they fashioned splints from straight birch branches, securing them with leather straps woven from sinew. The splints were then wrapped in layers of moss, which, when kept dry, provided cushioning and modest insulation, preventing the cold from turning the broken bone into a source of endless pain. Burns from open fire were another hazard. Rather than dousing the flame with water, often scarce in winter, Ice Age groups would smear the affected skin with a paste made from ground yarrow leaves and honey. Yarrow contains flavonoids that promote clotting, while honey's high sugar concentration draws out moisture, creating an environment hostile to infection. Laboratory tests on honey-based dressings confirm they can inhibit a wide range of bacteria, including Staphylococcus aureus, which was likely present even in prehistoric times. Lastly, the ancient triage system was instinctive. The strongest, usually the prime age male, would stay with the most severely injured, sharing body heat and guarding the fire. Meanwhile, the rest of the group continued hunting or gathering to ensure food supply did not collapse. This communal approach mirrors today's stay alive protocols, where the priority is to preserve core temperature, stop bleeding, and secure shelter before treating other injuries. So next time you pack a first aid kit, consider adding a small piece of rawhide, a pinch of charcoal, and perhaps a tiny tube of honey. They are not merely novelty items, they are direct descendants of techniques that kept Ice Age peoples alive when the world was an endless white desert. And in a pinch, remembering that ancient wisdom, keep pressure on the wound, use natural antiseptics, and never let the patient lose heat, might just be the difference between a scar and a story.